The hardest part wasn't watching my parents miss my wedding. It was realizing that, at the exact moment I promised forever to the man I loved, they had already decided someone else mattered more. People often ask whether I cried on my wedding day. The honest answer is yes, just not for the reason they imagine. The ballroom looked exactly as I had dreamed it would. Soft ivory roses lined the aisle. Hundreds of tiny candles reflected against crystal chandeliers, turning the room into something almost unreal. The string quartet played quietly while guests whispered to one another, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Everything was perfect, except the 4 empty chairs in the front row. 2 belonged to my parents. 2 belonged to my sister and whoever she happened to be dating that month. I kept glancing toward the entrance every few seconds, convincing myself traffic had delayed them. Maybe they were parking. Maybe security had slowed them down. Maybe Dad had forgotten his suit jacket. There was always another explanation. There always had been. My maid of honor, Lauren, squeezed my hand. "They'll be here." She smiled because that was what good friends did when reality hadn't caught up with hope yet. I smiled back because pretending had become second nature. Michael found me standing behind the chapel doors only minutes before the ceremony. He didn't ask whether my family had arrived. He already knew. Instead, he gently adjusted the sleeve of my wedding dress before brushing a loose strand of hair away from my face. "You don't have to keep looking." His voice was soft. I hated that he was right. "I know. You ready?" I looked toward those empty seats one last time. I've been ready for years. The music began. The doors opened. Every guest stood. I walked down the aisle without my father, without my mother wiping away tears, without my sister making sarcastic comments about my dress, without anyone from the family I had spent 32 years trying to earn love from. Only Michael waited. Only Michael smiled. Only Michael looked at me as though I had never needed to compete with anyone to deserve being chosen. For a little while, I forgot about the empty chairs. His vows made me laugh through tears. Mine made him cry. When we exchanged rings, the applause felt warm enough to fill the spaces my family had left behind. For one beautiful hour, I believed I could finally stop wondering why I had never been enough. The reception was already underway when my phone vibrated inside my bridal clutch. Lauren glanced at the screen. "Do you want me to ignore it?" The caller ID simply read Mom. My stomach tightened. I answered. Before I could say hello, my mother's hurried voice rushed through the speaker. "Emma, I'm sorry, sweetheart. Rachel had an emergency." No congratulations. No apology that meant anything. No question about whether I was happy. Only Rachel. Again, I closed my eyes. What kind of emergency? There was a pause. The florist accidentally sent white lilies instead of blush roses to her engagement party planning meeting. I waited. Surely there was more. A car accident. A hospital. Someone hurt. Anything. Instead, my mother continued as if explaining something perfectly reasonable. She was devastated. She needed us. I looked across the ballroom. Michael was laughing with my college roommates. Our photographer was capturing grandparents dancing. Children chased each other across the polished floor. Life was happening. Without them, you skipped your daughter's wedding. Another silence. "We thought you'd understand." Those 6 words settled deeper than any insult ever could. They didn't miss my wedding because they couldn't come. They missed it because, somewhere inside them, they had already decided Rachel's disappointment over flower colors mattered more than watching their oldest daughter get married. I thanked my mother for calling. She sounded relieved, almost grateful that I wasn't yelling. She didn't realize silence can be far colder than anger. I slipped my phone back into my bag. Michael walked over with 2 glasses of champagne. "You okay?" I looked around the room one more time. At the empty chairs. At the family table with 4 untouched place settings. At the life I was beginning. Then I smiled. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because something inside me had quietly reached its limit. "They made their choice today," I said. I took Michael's hand before walking toward the dance floor. "I just don't think they understand yet what it cost them. I used to believe my parents loved us equally. That illusion lasted until I was old enough to notice the pattern. People don't become the forgotten child because of one dramatic moment. It happens quietly. Birthday after birthday. Holiday after holiday. Achievement after achievement. Each time, you're told there will be another chance. Each time, someone else needs your parents just a little more. In our family, that someone was always Rachel. She was 3 years younger than me, with golden blonde hair that seemed to glow under every light and a smile that convinced strangers she could never do anything wrong. My mother used to say Rachel was sensitive. My father preferred spirited. I eventually settled on a different word. Untouchable. When Rachel cried because she lost a soccer game at 12, my parents canceled the weekend trip they had promised me after I earned straight A's for the entire school year. Mom hugged me afterward. We'll celebrate another time. We never did. When I received a scholarship to one of the best business schools in the state, Dad missed the award ceremony because Rachel had forgotten to finish a history project due the next morning. Apparently, building a model volcano required both of my parents. Accepting an academic award did not. When I bought my first car at 24 without asking anyone for help, they barely looked at it. A month later, Rachel leased a luxury SUV she couldn't afford. Dad drove 2 hours just to surprise her with a giant red bow for the hood. Mom filled the trunk with expensive gifts. They posted pictures online. The caption read, "So proud of our baby girl." I clicked the little heart beneath the post. Not because I agreed. Because pretending things didn't hurt was easier than explaining why they did. Friends noticed long before I admitted it. Lauren once asked me, "Do they even realize they treat you differently?" I laughed. "I don't think they mean to." That was the excuse I made for years. Intentions. Good intentions. Parents are complicated. Families are messy. Everyone says those things. Eventually, I realized something uncomfortable. The outcome matters more than the intention. Whether they meant to or not, I always learned the same lesson. Rachel came first. I came second. Every single time. When Michael entered my life, he noticed the pattern almost immediately. He never criticized my parents. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he simply asked questions. Why did they cancel dinner again? Why are you driving across town to help your sister move when she's bringing 5 friends? Why do you apologize every time your mother interrupts you? At first, I defended them. They're under a lot of stress. Rachel's going through something. They don't realize they're doing it. Michael would nod. Then he'd quietly change the subject. He understood something I didn't. People rarely change when everyone around them keeps explaining away their choices. The first time he met my parents, he brought flowers for my mother and a bottle of wine for my father. He listened politely to stories that somehow always became stories about Rachel. Rachel's latest promotion. Rachel's vacation. Rachel's apartment. Rachel's dating life. Rachel's future. After dinner, we sat in his car outside my parents' house. He rested both hands on the steering wheel for a long moment before speaking. "I think your family loves you." I smiled. "See? I told you." He turned toward me. "But I don't think they've ever learned how to choose you." His words stayed with me for weeks. I wanted to argue. Instead, memories kept proving him right. When Michael proposed, he rented the rooftop where we'd had our first date. The city skyline shimmered behind him as he knelt with the ring in his trembling hands. It was perfect. The first person I called afterward was my mother. She answered on the 4th ring. "Emma, can I call you back? Rachel's having a meltdown because the bridal boutique discontinued a dress she liked." I looked down at the engagement ring sparkling on my finger. "I just wanted to tell you something." "Oh, sweetheart, I'm sure it can wait until tomorrow." It couldn't, but I let it wait anyway. Looking back now, maybe that should have been the moment I understood exactly how my wedding day was going to end. The signs had been there all along. I just kept mistaking hope for evidence. If there was one moment I should have walked away, it wasn't my wedding day. It was 3 weeks before it. That's when I learned exactly what my parents believed my future was worth. Wedding planning has a strange way of exposing people. Some couples argue about flowers. Others fight over seating charts. Michael and I argued over whether we really needed a 6-tier cake. Compared to most engaged couples, life felt wonderfully uncomplicated. We paid for almost everything ourselves. I had spent years building my career as a financial analyst, saving carefully while friends chased luxury vacations and expensive cars. Michael, an architect with more patience than anyone I'd ever known, believed debt should never follow a celebration. "We're throwing a party," he liked to say, "not buying a problem." We agreed on almost everything. The only thing I secretly hoped for was that my parents would finally want to be part of something important in my life. Months earlier, my mother had insisted they wanted to contribute. "We've always planned to help pay for your wedding." Dad nodded from across the dinner table. "It's only fair." I almost laughed. Fair wasn't a word our family had ever understood. Still, I believed them. Not because I expected the money, because I wanted to believe it meant something else. That maybe, for once, they had chosen me. 3 weeks before the ceremony, Mom called. "Can you stop by tonight?" Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. I think we found the perfect surprise. I drove to my parents' house after work with genuine excitement. For the first time in months, I imagined leaving their home feeling like someone's daughter instead of someone's obligation. Rachel's convertible was already parked outside. That should have been my first warning. Inside, gift catalogs, bridal magazines, and financial paperwork covered the dining room table. Rachel sat in the center of it all, smiling as though the meeting had always been about her. Mom waved me over. There you are. Dad cleared his throat. We've been talking. I remained standing. So have I missed something? Rachel leaned back in her chair. I didn't expect you this early. I looked at my mother. She avoided my eyes. Dad folded his hands together. You know Rachel and Tyler are thinking about getting engaged. I nodded slowly. So, they found a wonderful lakefront venue. I waited. It requires a substantial deposit. Another pause. Then Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We've decided to help them. I frowned. I thought this meeting was about my wedding. It is. She smiled as if that explained everything. We're asking whether you'd understand if we redirected the money we'd promised you. For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. The silence stretched. No one laughed. Rachel examined her freshly painted nails. Dad stared at the table. Mom waited for me to solve the problem she had created. Redirected? Dad finally spoke. Rachel's opportunity is time-sensitive. I looked around the room. My wedding is in 3 weeks. We know. You promised months ago. We know. And you're giving that money to Rachel? Mom quickly added. Only because she needs it more. There it was. The sentence I'd heard in different forms my entire life. She needs it more. Rachel finally looked at me. I mean, you've already paid for most of your wedding anyway. As though that somehow justified everything. As though responsibility had become another reason to overlook me. I could have argued. I could have reminded them of every promise. Every disappointment. Every sacrifice. Instead, something unexpected happened. I felt calm. Not because I wasn't hurt. Because the puzzle pieces finally fit together. They weren't making another temporary mistake. They were making the same choice they had always made. Only this time, there was no room left for excuses. I stood up. You should use the money however you want. Mom blinked. Really? Of course. Dad looked relieved. I knew you'd understand. No, they misunderstood completely. Understanding wasn't forgiveness. Acceptance wasn't agreement. And silence wasn't surrender. I hugged my mother goodbye. Shook my father's hand. Even wished Rachel luck. Driving home, I didn't cry. When I walked through the front door, Michael looked up from reviewing blueprints. How did it go? I slipped off my engagement ring just long enough to wash my hands. Then I put it back on. They gave our wedding money to Rachel. He stared at me for several seconds. Finally, he asked the only question that mattered. So, what do you want to do now? I looked at the ring on my finger, then at the home we were slowly building together. For the first time in my life, my answer had nothing to do with earning my parents' approval. I want to marry you, I said quietly. The rest, they can keep. People assume cutting off your family feels dramatic. For me, it felt strangely quiet. There was no screaming, no final argument, no slammed doors, just fewer phone calls, fewer holidays, eventually, fewer expectations. The morning after our wedding, Michael and I left for a small cabin overlooking Lake Michigan. It wasn't an extravagant honeymoon. We couldn't justify spending tens of thousands of dollars on a week away when we were saving for a home. Instead, we spent our days hiking wooded trails, drinking coffee on the porch before sunrise, and talking about the kind of life we wanted to build. Not the kind we wanted people to envy. The kind we wanted to come home to. On our third morning, my phone buzzed. Rachel had posted photos from what she proudly called her dream venue consultation. There she was, smiling beneath crystal chandeliers. My parents stood beside her, laughing. Mom's caption read, "Making unforgettable memories with our baby girl." The timestamp told me everything. Those pictures had been taken at almost the exact same time Michael and I were exchanging vows. I stared at the screen for a long moment before locking it. Michael looked up from the breakfast he was making. You don't have to keep checking. I know. You looking for something? I smiled faintly. No. He walked over and kissed my forehead. Good. Because there was nothing left to find. The answer had already been given. When we returned home, life became wonderfully ordinary. Michael threw himself into designing sustainable commercial buildings. I accepted a promotion that required longer hours, but came with opportunities one had dreamed about for years. Instead of spending weekends driving across town to solve Rachel's latest emergency, we renovated our little townhouse one room at a time. Instead of buying expensive furniture, we searched estate sales. Instead of competing with everyone else, we invested. Every bonus, every tax refund, every extra dollar. Michael liked to joke that compound interest was the least exciting miracle in the world. I disagreed. Watching small decisions become life-changing once felt miraculous enough. Years passed faster than I expected. One investment property became two. Two became five. Then came our first apartment building. Later, a small commercial plaza. Each purchase wasn't spectacular on its own, but together, they quietly transformed our future. Success never arrived with fireworks. It arrived through spreadsheets, long meetings, late nights, risk calculations, patience. The kind of patience my parents had never understood because Rachel had always wanted everything immediately. Ironically, they almost never asked about our lives. When they did call, it usually lasted less than 5 minutes. Rachel needs help moving. Rachel's changing careers. Rachel's thinking about starting a business. Occasionally my mother would ask, almost as an afterthought, "And how are you two doing?" "Great. That's wonderful." Then she'd return to talking about Rachel. Eventually, even those conversations stopped. Birthdays became text messages. Christmas became cards arriving several days late. Family dinners disappeared altogether. It wasn't because I formally cut them off. I simply stopped chasing people who weren't walking toward me. One evening, nearly 6 years after our wedding, Michael and I stood on the balcony of the home we had finally built from the ground up. The sunset painted the lake in shades of gold. He handed me a glass of wine. "Do you miss them?" I considered the question carefully. "I missed the family I wanted." He nodded. "Not the one you had." No, there was an important difference. Grieving real people eventually ends. Grieving who they could have been takes much longer. For the first time in years, I realized I had gone an entire month without thinking about Rachel. Not because I had forgiven everything, because my own life had finally become more interesting than hers. Peace doesn't arrive the day someone apologizes. Sometimes it arrives the day their opinion no longer determines your happiness. That night, I slept better than I had in years. I believed the story was finally over. My parents had made their choice. I had made mine. Our lives had quietly moved in different directions. I couldn't have known that somewhere across town, Rachel had begun making a series of financial decisions that would slowly pull my parents into a disaster so large it would eventually lead them back to my front door. And when that knock finally came, it wouldn't be because they suddenly missed their oldest daughter. It would be because they had run out of everyone else to save them. Disaster rarely announces itself. Most of the time, it arrives disguised as one more opportunity. I didn't know exactly when Rachel's life began unraveling. I only learned the story much later, after lawyers, bankers, and court documents filled in the blanks. By then, the damage had already been done. According to my father, it all started with what Rachel called the business of her dreams. She wanted to open a luxury event company, destination weddings, corporate galas, celebrity parties. The presentations looked beautiful. The projections looked impressive. The promises sounded endless. She told everyone she would double their investment within 3 years. My parents never questioned a single number. Why would they? Rachel had never needed proof. She only needed confidence. Mom proudly told friends that their youngest daughter was finally becoming an entrepreneur. Dad withdrew a large portion of his retirement savings to become her first investor. When that wasn't enough, they refinanced their house. Again. Then they guaranteed a business loan with the bank. Again. Each decision was explained the same way. "We're investing in family." Those words would eventually cost them almost everything they owned. The first year looked promising. Rachel rented an expensive downtown office with glass walls and imported furniture. She leased a luxury SUV under the company's name. She hired more employees than she could realistically afford. Every social media post showed champagne toasts, smiling clients, and glamorous venues. Success looked effortless. Reality rarely photographs well. Behind those polished images, invoices piled up. Payments arrived late. Several large clients canceled contracts. Expenses continued growing. Rachel responded the only way she knew how. She spent more. She believed appearances would attract bigger opportunities. Instead, appearances became another bill. The second year was worse. One investment turned into another loan. One loan required another guarantee. Every problem became temporary. Every deadline became negotiable. At least that's what Rachel kept telling my parents. Dad believed her. Mom defended her. If we don't help now, everything she's worked for will disappear. Neither of them asked whether there had ever been much to save. One evening, while Michael and I were reviewing renovation plans for another apartment building we'd recently purchased, my phone buzzed with a news alert from our local business journal. A familiar company name caught my attention. Sterling's Signature Events. Rachel's company. The article was brief. A major lawsuit had been filed after an upscale wedding venue accused the company of failing to pay nearly $600,000 in contracted services. I read the headline twice. Michael noticed my expression. What happened? I handed him the phone. He read silently before setting it on the kitchen island. Is that your sister's company? Apparently. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Finally, he asked, do you think your parents know? I looked out the window. I think they probably know before anyone else. For the next several weeks, more stories surfaced. Another vendor sued. Another lender demanded payment. Another project collapsed halfway through construction. The glamorous photos disappeared from Rachel's social media. So did many of her employees. Then one afternoon, while leaving a meeting with one of our commercial tenants, I noticed a familiar figure walking into a downtown bank. Dad. He looked older. Much older. His shoulders had rounded. His hair had become almost completely gray. He carried a thick folder pressed tightly against his chest. For a split second, I considered calling out to him. Instead, I watched through the windshield as he disappeared inside. When he emerged nearly an hour later, he wasn't alone. Rachel walked beside him. She looked frustrated. He looked exhausted. She talked constantly, waving paperwork through the air. Dad simply nodded. Even from across the parking lot, I recognized the expression on his face. It was the look of someone trying desperately to solve a problem that had already grown larger than he could imagine. I drove away without letting them see me. That evening, I told Michael what I'd seen. He quietly stirred his coffee. They're in trouble. I know. Do you think they'll ask you for help? I laughed softly. No, not because they didn't need help. Because asking me would require admitting they had been wrong. And if there was one thing my parents had always protected more fiercely than Rachel, it was the belief that choosing her had never been a mistake. I would soon learn that bankruptcy has a way of stripping away even the strongest illusions. And when those illusions finally collapsed, the first door they knocked on would be mine. The knock came at 7:12 on a rainy Tuesday morning. Not a polite knock. Not the confident knock of someone dropping by to visit. It was hesitant, uneven. The kind of knock people use when they're not sure they'll be welcomed. I was working from home that day, reviewing a due diligence report for a commercial property acquisition while Michael had already left for an early meeting. At first, I ignored it. Delivery drivers usually left packages by the door. Then the knock came again, longer this time. I walked to the front window and gently pulled back the curtain. For a moment, I didn't recognize them. My father looked thinner than I had ever seen him. His expensive wool coats had been replaced by a faded windbreaker that hung loosely from his shoulders. My mother's hair, once perfectly styled every morning, was streaked with more gray than blonde. She clutched a worn leather handbag with both hands as though it were the only thing keeping her steady. Time hadn't simply passed. It had collected its debt. I opened the door. No one spoke immediately. Finally, my mother smiled. Or at least she tried to. Hi, sweetheart. It had been nearly 7 years. 7 years since they chose Rachel over my wedding. 7 years of birthdays remembered only by automated text messages. 7 years without a single visit. And somehow they expected to begin with, hi, sweetheart. Mom. Dad. Dad cleared his throat. We were hoping, maybe we could talk. I stepped aside without answering. They entered cautiously, looking around the house. The open-concept kitchen. The hardwood floors. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. The framed travel photographs lining the hallway. None of it had existed the last time they'd seen me. Mom slowly turned in a circle. It's beautiful. Thank you. I didn't realize. She stopped herself. Didn't realize what? That I'd build a good life without them. Dad remained standing instead of sitting. He seemed uncomfortable accepting hospitality he hadn't earned. We won't take much of your time. I poured 3 cups of coffee anyway. Old habits die slowly. We sat at the dining table where silence settled between us. Eventually, my mother reached into her purse and removed a thick envelope. She pushed it toward me. I think you should look at this. I didn't touch it. What is it? Dad answered quietly. Our financial records. That surprised me. Not because they were showing me paperwork, because my father had always believed family problems stayed inside the family. The fact that he was willing to place those documents in front of me meant the situation was already worse than I imagined. I don't understand. Mom lowered her eyes. We've lost the house. The words hung in the room. I didn't react. Not outwardly. Dad continued. The bank foreclosed 3 months ago. And Rachel? Another silence. She's staying with friends. That answer told me everything. When someone says a 40-year-old adult is staying with friends, it usually means there isn't anywhere else left to go. Mom took a shaky breath. We know we made mistakes. I waited. We should have listened more. Another pause. We should have been better parents. Those were words I had imagined hearing hundreds of times. Yet now that they had finally arrived, they felt strangely empty. Apologies offered after every option has disappeared rarely sound like redemption. They sound like strategy. Dad slid the envelope closer. We owe more than we can pay. I see. There are lawsuits. I read about some of them. His eyes widened. You knew? I knew enough. Mom leaned forward. Emma, people have told us you've done very well. There it was. The real conversation had finally entered the room. Not regret. Not reconciliation. Information. They had asked around. They knew Michael and I owned investment properties. They knew our business had grown. They knew we could probably solve problems they could no longer control. Dad folded his hands together. We're not asking for charity. I almost smiled. People usually say that immediately before asking for exactly that. We're asking for help understanding everything. That, at least, sounded believable. I looked at the unopened envelope. Years ago, I had built a career analyzing financial statements, hidden liabilities, and failing businesses. If anyone could understand what had happened, it was me. I'll review the documents, I said calmly. Relief flooded both of their faces at once. But let me be clear. Their smiles faded. I'm looking because I want the truth. Neither of them answered. And whatever I find. I rested one hand lightly on the unopened file. May not be what either of you expects. For the first time since they arrived, my father looked genuinely afraid. Not of losing more money, but of what the numbers might finally reveal. I learned a long time ago that numbers don't lie. People do. The morning after my parents left, I carried the envelope into my home office and spread every document across the conference table. Bank statements, loan agreements, mortgage records, credit card balances, business ledgers, court filings. Nearly 400 pages telling the story no one in my family had been willing to admit out loud. Michael walked in carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Looks serious. It is. He set one beside me before quietly leaving the room. He knew this wasn't just accounting anymore. It was archaeology. Every document uncovered another layer of the past. I started with the business accounts. Rachel's company had generated respectable revenue during its first 18 months. Not extraordinary, but enough to survive. That wasn't what destroyed it. What destroyed it was something much simpler. She had confused income with wealth. Every profitable month became an excuse to spend more. Luxury office furniture, designer decor, private drivers, 5-star hotels for client meetings, marketing campaigns that cost more than entire weddings. None of those expenses produced lasting value. They only created the illusion of success. Then I found something that made me stop turning pages. Personal transfers. Dozens of them. Large sums moving directly from company accounts into Rachel's personal accounts. Not salaries. Not documented reimbursements. Simple electronic transfers. Again, and again, and again. By themselves, they looked suspicious. Combined with the company's unpaid taxes and vendor invoices, they painted a far more dangerous picture. I continued reading. Several loans carried my father's signature. Others listed my parents as personal guarantors. One document caught my attention immediately. A line of credit secured against their house. Maximum amount approved. Every dollar withdrawn. Every dollar gone. I leaned back in my chair. Michael looked over from the doorway. What is it? They didn't just invest in Rachel. I tapped the document. They pledged everything they owned. He slowly nodded. So if the company failed, they failed with it. I spent the next several hours reconstructing the timeline. Each financial crisis followed the same pattern. Rachel overspent. A lender demanded payment. My parents refinanced something. The business survived another few months. Then the cycle repeated. It wasn't a business strategy. It was life support. Eventually, life support always ends. Near the bottom of the final folder, I found correspondence between Rachel and one of her accountants. Most of it was routine. Then one email stood out. It had been sent nearly 2 years before the lawsuits became public. The accountant had written, "If these shareholder withdrawals continue without proper documentation, both the company and the guarantors may face significant legal exposure." Rachel's reply contained only one sentence. "My parents will handle it." I read those 5 words 3 times. Not because they surprised me, because they summarized my entire childhood. My parents will handle it. That had always been Rachel's solution. Broken promises, unpaid bills, missed deadlines. Someone else would fix everything. Usually my parents. Sometimes me. Never Rachel. I closed the laptop and walked onto the back patio. The lake was perfectly still. For years I had wondered whether my parents had loved Rachel more than me. Looking at those documents, I realized the truth was more complicated. Love wasn't what had destroyed them. Enabling had. They had rescued her so many times that she had never learned the cost of failure. Eventually, failure arrived anyway. Only this time, it collected from everyone. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. "Dad." I answered. "Did you have a chance to look?" "Yes." A hopeful silence followed. Finally, he asked, "Can you help us?" I chose my words carefully. "I can explain what happened." And after that, I looked back toward the office where hundreds of pages still covered the table. There are things in these records you don't know. His breathing became noticeably slower. "What things?" "I don't want to discuss them over the phone." Another long pause. "When can we come?" "Tomorrow morning." After we hung up, Michael joined me outside. "What are you thinking?" I watched the sun sink behind the trees. "My parents believe they're victims." "Aren't they?" "Partly. And the other part?" I turned toward the house. The numbers tell a different story. Because hidden beneath the unpaid loans and collapsing business was something none of them seemed to realize. Someone hadn't merely made reckless decisions. Someone had been quietly moving money long before the company ever collapsed. And by the time I finished tracing where it had gone, one person in my family would no longer be able to blame bad luck for what happened next. I didn't invite my parents over to save them. I invited them over to show them the truth. They arrived exactly at 9. Neither of them looked as though they had slept. Dad carried another folder. Mom held a notebook filled with handwritten questions. For years they had believed every explanation Rachel gave them. Now they wanted answers from me. I led them into my office. The conference table was still covered with neatly organized stacks of documents. Every loan, every bank statement, every transfer, every email. Dad looked around the room and quietly whispered, "You've already gone through all of it." "I have." Mom sat down slowly. "So tell us." I didn't begin with accusations. I began with facts. Rachel's company wasn't destroyed because one client canceled. They exchanged confused looks. It wasn't destroyed because the economy changed. Dad frowned. "Then what happened?" I slid the first spreadsheet toward him. "This is every transfer from the business account into Rachel's personal accounts." He adjusted his glasses. His expression changed almost immediately. "There must be some mistake." "There isn't." I handed him another document. "Those transfers total more than $1.3 million over 3 years." Mom stared at me. "No." "Yes." "She told us she wasn't paying herself." "I know." Silence filled the room. I continued. "She wasn't paying herself through payroll." I pointed to another column. "She was simply moving company money into her own accounts." Dad's hands began shaking. Maybe they were reimbursements. I slid another folder across the table. I looked for receipts. "There aren't any." Mom slowly covered her mouth. I wasn't finished. "The company stopped paying several vendors months before it stopped paying Rachel." Dad looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means she chose herself before she chose the business." He lowered his eyes. I opened the final folder. The accountant warned her. I handed him the printed email. He read every line. Then he read Rachel's reply. "My parents will handle it." The room became completely silent. Dad removed his glasses. For several seconds, he simply stared at the paper. Finally, in a voice I barely recognized, he asked, "She knew?" "Yes." "She knew we were risking everything?" "Yes." Mom began crying quietly. Not dramatic sobs. The exhausted kind that come when denial finally collapses. "I don't understand." I looked at her gently. "I think you do." She closed her eyes. "We trusted her." "I know. We thought we were helping." "I know." "And she." She couldn't finish the sentence. Dad finally did. "She used us." No one spoke. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. The office suddenly felt much smaller than it had an hour earlier. Dad straightened the papers into a neat pile. Then he asked the question I had expected from the beginning. Can the money be recovered? I answered honestly. Some of it. Both of them looked up. What do you mean? Rachel transferred significant amounts into personal investment accounts. Dad blinked. Investment accounts? I nodded. Several real estate purchases. Mom stared at me. She told us she couldn't even afford rent. That wasn't true. I watched the realization spread across their faces. The expensive vacations, the designer handbags, the luxury SUV, the private club memberships. None of them had been financed by success. They had been financed by money my parents believed was keeping the business alive. Dad slowly leaned back in his chair. I mortgaged our house. His voice cracked. So she could buy investment properties? I believe so. Another long silence followed. Then, for the first time in my entire life, my father looked directly at me with tears in his eyes. I should have believed you years ago. I didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say about the past. Only the future remained. Dad took a slow breath. What happens now? I folded my hands together. Now we stop treating this as a family disagreement. They both looked at me. We treat it for what it actually is. And what is that? I met his eyes without hesitation. A financial fraud investigation. Neither of them spoke. For years they had protected Rachel from consequences. Now they finally understood that protecting her any longer wouldn't save her. It would only make them accomplices. And before the week was over, they would have to make the one choice they had avoided for their entire lives. For the first time, they would have to choose between telling the truth or protecting their favorite daughter one last time. The meeting with Rachel happened 3 days later. She didn't come because she wanted to make things right. She came because she believed she could still control the story. Dad called the night before. She agreed to meet. Does she know what I've found? No. Good. I only told her we needed to discuss the business. Then don't say anything else. When Rachel arrived at my office the next afternoon, she looked remarkably composed. Designer sunglasses, perfect makeup, an expensive handbag that certainly hadn't been purchased with an unemployed person's income. She hugged our mother, barely acknowledged Dad, then turned toward me. So, she smiled. I hear you've been playing accountant. I've been reading. She laughed. Financial records never tell the whole story. No, they tell enough. We sat around the same conference table where my parents had faced the truth. Rachel crossed her legs confidently. I assume everyone wants to know what happened. Dad nodded. Yes. She sighed dramatically. The market changed. I remained silent. Several major clients breached their contracts. Still silent. The pandemic aftershocks affected luxury events. She continued speaking, filling every pause before anyone else could. Cash flow became impossible. Mom reached for her hand. We understand, sweetheart. I noticed Dad slowly pulling his hand away. It was the first small change I'd seen in him. Rachel didn't notice. She kept talking. I sacrificed everything trying to save that company. That was when I opened the first folder. You transferred $1.3 million into your personal accounts. Her smile disappeared for less than a second. Then it returned. Owner distributions. I slid another document forward. Undocumented. They were temporary. The money never came back. Rachel shrugged. Business isn't always simple. No, it isn't. I placed photographs of 3 investment properties on the table. 1 condominium in Chicago. A vacation home in Florida. A rental duplex purchased through a limited liability company. Dad stared at the addresses. What are these? Rachel answered too quickly. Nothing. I looked directly at him. These properties were purchased while your house was being refinanced. Mom frowned. Rachel, they're investments. Dad looked confused. You told us you couldn't make payroll. I couldn't. You told us creditors were threatening the company. They were. You told us every dollar we gave you kept the business alive. It did. I calmly turned another page. The down payment for the Chicago condominium came from the same account your parents used to guarantee operating expenses. Rachel's jaw tightened. That's your interpretation. It's the bank's documentation. Silence. For the first time, Rachel looked uncertain. She glanced toward our mother. Mom didn't rescue her. She looked at Dad. He stared at the paperwork. Finally, Rachel turned toward me. What exactly are you trying to do? I'm explaining what happened. You always wanted Mom and Dad to think I was the bad one. I almost smiled. No, I wanted them to see the truth. She leaned forward. You think you're so perfect. I don't. You've been waiting years for this. I considered that carefully. No. I stopped waiting years ago. That answer seemed to unsettle her more than any accusation could have. Dad slowly picked up the accountant's email. His hands no longer trembled. He simply read Rachel's reply aloud. My parents will handle it. He looked at her. Did you write this? Rachel didn't answer immediately. Finally, she whispered, yes. And you knew we had mortgaged the house? Another pause. Yes. Mom covered her face. Dad closed the folder. The room became painfully quiet. Rachel reached across the table. Dad. He gently moved his chair back. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just enough to create a space that had never existed between them before. I spent 40 years believing protecting you was my job. His voice remained calm. I never realized I was protecting you from becoming responsible for your own choices. Rachel's confidence vanished. She looked toward Mom again. This time Mom lowered her eyes. No one came to her defense. No one explained. No one blamed bad luck. For the first time in her life, Rachel sat alone with the consequences of her own decisions. I gathered the documents into one neat stack. I've already spoken with an attorney. Rachel's head snapped toward me. What? The evidence has been organized. Dad looked at me. You already knew what needed to happen. I nodded. Yes. Because some problems can be solved with money. Others can only be solved with accountability. And after spending an entire lifetime watching my family protect the wrong person, I finally witnessed something I had once believed impossible. They chose the truth. Even though it meant losing the daughter they had spent decades trying to save. People often imagine justice as one dramatic moment. A judge strikes a gavel. Someone is handcuffed. A guilty person finally admits everything. Real justice is usually quieter than that. It begins with paperwork. Within 2 weeks, my parents retained an attorney who specialized in financial fraud and commercial litigation. Not because I forced them. Because for the first time in decades, they stopped asking what would protect Rachel. They started asking what the law required. I attended the first meeting only because the attorney requested that I explain how I had reconstructed the financial timeline. His office overlooked downtown. The conference room contained little more than a long table, legal pads, and boxes waiting to be filled with evidence. He listened carefully while I walked through every transfer, every refinancing, every personal purchase, every warning Rachel had ignored. When I finished, he closed the last folder. This is substantially stronger than I expected. Dad looked down. So what happens now? The attorney answered without emotion. We preserve every financial record. He looked toward my parents. And we cooperate fully. Mom swallowed hard. Against our own daughter? He didn't soften his words. Against the evidence. That sentence stayed with me. Against the evidence. Not against family. Not against love. Against facts that could no longer be denied. Over the following months, subpoenas were issued. Banks produced additional records. Investment firms disclosed account histories. Property purchases were traced through shell companies Rachel believed no one would ever connect to her. She had been careful, just not careful enough. The accountant's warnings. Electronic transfers. Digital signatures. Closing documents. Individually, each document explained very little. Together, they formed a story impossible to ignore. Rachel called me several times. I never answered. She left voice messages instead. At first, she sounded angry. You've turned Mom and Dad against me. Then defensive. You don't understand how businesses work. Finally desperate. We're sisters. That was the first time she had used that word in years. Sisters. I listened to every message only once before saving them. Not because I needed proof. Because I wanted to remember how quickly people's language changes when consequences finally arrive. One afternoon, Dad visited our house alone. He looked healthier than he had during that first desperate morning. Still tired. Still grieving. But no longer pretending. He stood on our back patio watching the lake. I owe you an apology. I remained silent. Not because you needed to hear it. He smiled sadly. Because I need to say it. He turned toward me. I kept believing that if I loved Rachel enough, she'd eventually become responsible. I nodded. I know. But every time I rescued her, you taught her someone else would pay. His eyes filled with tears. Yes. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question I never expected. When did you stop trying to convince us? I looked across the water. The day you missed my wedding. He closed his eyes. I thought that day only hurt you. It changed me. I know that now. There was nothing cruel in my voice when I answered. It also changed you. A month later, the attorney called. The investigation had uncovered enough evidence for civil recovery proceedings and potential criminal referrals. Several of Rachel's investment properties were frozen pending court review. Accounts she believed were untouchable suddenly became inaccessible. The illusion of endless escape finally ended. When my parents received the official notices, they didn't celebrate. Neither did I. No one wins when a family reaches a courtroom. Some people simply lose less than others. That evening, Michael found me sitting on the back porch as the sun disappeared beyond the lake. "You okay?" I nodded. "I think so. Does it feel like revenge?" I considered the question carefully. "No. What does it feel like?" I watched the last light disappear across the water. "It feels like the truth finally caught up." For years, my parents had believed missing my wedding was the worst mistake they had ever made. They were wrong. That day had only revealed who they were. Their greatest mistake had been spending decades protecting one child from every consequence. Because once those consequences finally arrived, they didn't just take Rachel's future. They took the family my parents had spent a lifetime believing they were saving. The courthouse was quieter than I expected. Movies had taught me to expect raised voices, dramatic objections, and emotional speeches. Real courtrooms were different. People spoke softly. Lawyers carried heavy folders instead of delivering grand performances. Every sentence mattered because every sentence became part of the record. I sat beside Michael in the public gallery. My parents sat one row ahead of us. Neither of them looked toward Rachel. She entered with her attorney a few minutes before the hearing began. For the first time in my life, she looked uncertain. Not frightened. Not yet. But uncertain. She no longer wore designer labels. The expensive confidence that had followed her through every family gathering had disappeared. When the judge entered, the room rose together. Then everything began. The hearing focused on financial assets, bank accounts, investment properties, outstanding debts, ownership records. Nothing emotional, nothing personal, only facts. Rachel's attorney argued that the transfers represented legitimate compensation for years of unpaid work. Our side produced accounting records showing otherwise. The accountant's written warnings, the undocumented withdrawals, the personal real estate purchases, the guarantees signed by my parents. Each exhibit built upon the last, brick by brick, until the story Rachel had repeated for years collapsed under its own weight. Several times she leaned toward her attorney, whispering urgently. He answered less each time. Eventually, he stopped whispering altogether. There simply wasn't much left to argue. During a short recess, I walked into the hallway for some air. Dad joined me a minute later. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he said, "I used to think success meant protecting your children from pain." I looked at him. "And now, I think success is teaching them how to survive it." His voice carried no anger, only regret. "I failed, Rachel." I gently shook my head. "You loved her." I confused love with rescue. I couldn't disagree. The hearing resumed. Near the end, the judge approved temporary orders freezing additional assets while the larger civil case continued. Several properties would remain under court supervision. Financial records would undergo independent forensic review. Rachel lowered her head. For the first time, there would be no way to move money before someone noticed. No more hidden accounts. No more quiet transfers. No more parents signing another loan to erase yesterday's mistake. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for attorneys involved in unrelated cases. No one recognized us. Our family tragedy wasn't famous. It was simply another cautionary tale buried among thousands of legal files. Rachel emerged several minutes later. She saw my parents standing beside me. For a moment, I thought she might walk away. Instead, she approached slowly. "Dad." He looked at her calmly. "I'm sorry." The words sounded unfamiliar coming from her. She continued. "I never thought it would get this far." Dad answered quietly. "It got this far because every time it started, we stopped it." She blinked. "I don't understand." Every bad decision had a soft landing. He looked directly into her eyes. "We built those landings." Mom stood silently beside him. Rachel turned toward her. "Mom." Mom's voice trembled. "I spent your whole life protecting you." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I never realized I was protecting you from becoming an honest woman." Rachel began crying. Real tears this time. Not the dramatic tears that had once convinced my parents to empty savings accounts. These came from someone finally discovering that consequences don't disappear simply because you regret them. She looked at me last. I know you hate me. I answered honestly. I don't. Her expression changed. You don't. No. I stopped carrying that years ago. Then why didn't you stop this? Because that was still how she saw the world. She believed someone else controlled the outcome. Someone else held responsibility. Someone else could choose whether consequences happened. I quietly answered, I didn't do this, Rachel. You did. You made the decisions. No one said another word. She slowly walked toward the parking lot alone. Neither of our parents followed her. That single moment told me more than any courtroom ever could. For the first time in our lives, they allowed Rachel to carry the weight of her own choices. As Michael and I drove home, he reached across the center console and took my hand. How do you feel? I looked out the window as the courthouse disappeared behind us. Lighter. Not because Rachel was suffering. Not because my parents had finally admitted they were wrong. But because I no longer carried the impossible responsibility of proving my worth to people who had never truly seen it. That burden had finally found its rightful owners. And they understood, far too late, how much it had cost all of us. The final judgment came almost a year after my parents first knocked on my door. By then, life had settled into a rhythm again. Michael and I had stopped discussing court dates over dinner. My parents had moved into a modest townhouse after losing the family home. Rachel rarely contacted anyone. The silence surrounding our family no longer felt heavy. It simply felt honest. When the attorney called, his voice was calm. The court has issued its decision. I thanked him and drove alone to his office. Not because I expected to celebrate. Because I wanted to hear everything without distraction. He handed me a copy of the judgment. Several pages. Precise. Methodical. The court concluded that Rachel had knowingly diverted company funds for personal use, while continuing to solicit financial support from my parents under false representations. The investment properties acquired with those funds would be sold. The proceeds would first satisfy outstanding creditors. Any remaining balance would reduce the debts my parents had personally guaranteed. Some losses would never be recovered. Too much money had already disappeared. But the legal system had done what it could. No one received everything they wanted. Everyone accepted what the evidence allowed. That, I realized, was what justice actually looked like. Outside the office, I called Dad. It's over. His answer came quietly. I know. Were you there? Your mother and I attended. How are you? He hesitated. Sad. I appreciated his honesty. Not relieved. A little. And guilty. For what? For raising one daughter to believe consequences were optional. He paused. And another to believe love had to be earned. I closed my eyes. For years I had imagined hearing those words. When they finally came, they didn't erase the past. But they acknowledged it. Sometimes acknowledgement is the closest thing life offers to an apology. A week later, my parents asked whether Michael and I would have dinner with them. Not at our house. Not at theirs. At a small restaurant halfway between us. It felt appropriate. Neutral ground. When we arrived, they were already waiting. Mom looked healthier than she had in years. Older. Softer. Less anxious. Dad smiled as we approached. Not the confident smile I remembered from childhood. A humble one. Over dinner, we talked about ordinary things. Michael's latest project. My work. Their new neighborhood. For almost an hour, no one mentioned Rachel. Then Mom quietly placed a small envelope beside my plate. I found these while packing. Inside were dozens of photographs. My graduation. My scholarship ceremony. My engagement. Pictures I had assumed were lost forever. They were always in the attic, she whispered. I never realized how many memories of you we'd put away. I carefully looked through each photograph. There I was, smiling, standing alone at achievements my parents had barely acknowledged. I wasn't invisible. Evidence of my life had always existed. They had simply chosen not to look. Mom reached across the table. I can't give you back those years. I know. I wish I could. I gently squeezed her hand. I know. Dad looked at me. We don't expect forgiveness. I know. We only hope. He struggled to finish the sentence. That someday we can be part of your life without asking you to carry ours. That was the first request they had ever made that wasn't about Rachel. Not money. Not sacrifice. Not fixing someone else's mistakes. Just a chance to build something different. I looked at Michael. He smiled gently. Then I answered. We can start slowly. Neither of my parents cried. Neither did I. Some moments are too deep for tears. They simply settle quietly into your heart. Driving home that night, I thought about my wedding day. For years I believed that was the day I lost my family. I finally understood the truth. I had lost the family I wished I had. Only now were we beginning to build the one that was actually possible. Not perfect, not untouched by regret, but finally built on honesty instead of favoritism. And for the first time since I was a little girl, I drove away from my parents without feeling like I had come second to anyone. 5 years later, I stood beneath a white arch covered with fresh flowers. For just a moment, the scene reminded me of another wedding. The one my parents had missed. The one that had broken something inside me. This day was different. Michael stood beside me, smiling as children ran across the lawn of the lakeside property we now owned. Friends laughed beneath strings of lights. Music drifted through the summer air. There was no tension, no waiting for someone to arrive, no wondering whether I mattered enough. This celebration wasn't a wedding. It was the opening of a community scholarship foundation Michael and I had quietly built together. Every year, it would provide college tuition for students whose families couldn't afford to support their dreams, especially those who had learned to succeed without being anyone's favorite. As guests began taking their seats, I noticed my parents walking toward us. They looked older now. Tom had softened them. Dad no longer carried himself with quiet authority. Mom no longer rushed to solve everyone's problems. Instead, they carried folding chairs and helped volunteers arrange tables before anyone asked. Small things. Ordinary things. But real change is usually measured by ordinary moments. Mom hugged me gently. You've created something beautiful. We created it. I corrected, glancing at Michael. She smiled. I'm glad he found you. So am I. Dad stood beside us for a long moment before speaking. I used to believe success meant leaving money to your children. He looked around at the scholarship recipients gathering nearby. Now I think success is leaving them better examples. I squeezed his hand. Neither of us needed to say anything else. Some apologies continue through actions long after the words have been spoken. Rachel wasn't there. She had accepted a plea agreement related to the financial case years earlier, avoiding a lengthy trial by admitting responsibility for several fraudulent transactions. She had completed her sentence. She now worked for a nonprofit organization under strict financial supervision. According to my parents, she rented a small apartment and lived quietly. We exchanged a birthday card once each year. Nothing more. Not because I wished her harm. Because forgiveness doesn't always rebuild closeness. Sometimes it simply allows both people to move forward without bitterness. That was enough. As the ceremony began, the first scholarship recipient stepped onto the stage. She was the first person in her family to attend college. Her voice trembled as she thanked everyone who had believed in her. I smiled because I understood exactly what those words meant. Belief changes lives. So does the absence of it. After the ceremony ended, Michael and I walked down to the lake. The water was calm. The same lake where we had spent countless evenings talking about business, dreams, and the future we wanted to build. He slipped his hand into mine. Do you ever think about your wedding? I looked across the water. Sometimes. Does it still hurt? I considered the question carefully. No. What do you feel instead? I watched the sunlight reflect across the surface of the lake. Gratitude. He smiled. For what? For discovering who deserved a place in my life. Years ago, I believed my parents skipping my wedding had cost them everything. I was wrong. It cost all of us something. They lost years with the daughter they never truly saw. Rachel lost the illusion that someone else would always rescue her. And I lost the hope that my worth depended on winning my family's approval. Oddly enough, that last loss became the greatest gift of all. Because once I stopped trying to earn love that was never freely given, I finally had room to build a life filled with people who offered it without conditions. I looked back toward the laughter echoing across the lawn. My husband, my friends, my parents, now quietly helping stack empty chairs after every guest had eaten. Young students whose futures would begin with opportunity instead of disappointment. This was my family now. Not perfect, not untouched by regret, but honest, strong, and finally built on choice instead of obligation. My parents missed the day I became a bride. They could never get that day back. But in the years that followed, they chose to become the parents they should have been all along. As for me, I never needed them to rewrite the past. I only needed the freedom to write a different future. And in the end, that future became worth far more than anything I had ever lost.